Welcome, welcome. We're so happy to have you here. Welcome to the presentation of Mujeres Latinas Project with Janet Weaver. I am Danielle Dantema, the coordinator for the student chapter of Society of American Archivists for San Jose State University. It is really a mouthful, but I love being here. So SAASC and Reforma have teamed up to bring you this presentation. Janet Weaver, the assistant curator for the Iowa Women's Archive at the University of Iowa Libraries, is here to present on this project. So she'll tell us about preserving the history of Iowa Latinas with the Mujeres Latinas Project, and also she'll be talking about their website, Migration is Beautiful. So thank you, Janet, for being here today, and I'll pass it off to you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to talk with you all today. Before we start, I just want to see if I can share my screen. For me, the very hardest thing of every presentation is to do that. So, no, I did that wrong. Here we go. There. So can you see my screen, everyone? I can't hear you.
Yes.
Okay. So thank you again to everyone at SAASC and Reforma, but I especially want to thank Danielle and Samantha and Allison and Rosa for bringing us all together for this discussion of the history of the Mujeres Latinas Project, which actually started 15 years ago, over 15 years ago. And then the ongoing work that's been done to bring this information and history to a larger audience through the Migration is Beautiful Digital Humanities Project. So what I want to do today is highlight some of the stories preserved in the papers of Iowa Latinas in the Iowa Women's Archives. Their stories reside in the photographs, reports, memoirs, and fragmentary evidence preserved in the archives that chronicle the lives of Iowa Latinas, their families, as well as their organizations. They matter greatly because the stories these documents tell have the power to reframe our understanding of history and contribute to new interpretations of the past. Now, first, a little bit about the history of the Iowa Women's Archives. It was founded in 1992 with a mission to preserve the history of Iowa women from all walks of life. And of course, back then, it wasn't a given that the history of women was considered to be important and worthy of preservation in archival repositories. The idea for the archives began when two prominent Des Moines women, Louise Noun and Mary Louise Smith, pitched the idea to then University of Iowa President Hunter Rawlings. And Rawlings responded by providing the physical space in the main University of Iowa library, but raised the question of how would the archives be funded. And Louise Noun, who you see in this photograph on the right, had been a longtime collector of artwork by women. And when she returned to her Des Moines apartment, she decided the best way to raise that money would be to auction a particular painting that was hanging on the wall in her dining room. That painting was Frida Kahlo's self-portrait with loose hair. When Noun auctioned it at Christie's in New York, it netted $1.5 million. And that enabled the archives to open its doors in 1992 with Karen Mason as the first curator. So in a very real sense, the IWA owes its existence to three women: Louise Noun, Mary Louise Smith, and Frida Kahlo. At the archive's 10th anniversary symposium, former UI administrator Rusty Barcelo urged the IWA to start a project to preserve the papers of Iowa Latinas. And the Mujeres Latinas Project got underway in 2005. It really started as an oral history project. Between 2005 and 2007, over 100 oral histories were recorded with Iowa Latinas in different parts of the state. And here you see some of the women who recorded the interviews. Rachel Carrion focused on the Fort Madison area. Teresa Garcia did a tremendous amount of work in Mason City in northern Iowa. And Georgina Buendia Cruz, who you see up in the upper right-hand photograph, she did the Spanish language interviews, predominantly in the Williamsburg and Conesville areas in eastern and central Iowa. And down in the bottom, that's a photograph of me. I was in the Quad Cities area, which is in eastern Iowa, and that photograph was actually taken in the LULAC Center. That's the League of United Latin American Citizens, in the Quad Cities in Davenport, and several of the women who were interviewed for the project are in that photograph. Today, the oral histories and papers of Iowa Latinas gathered through the Mujeres Latina Project are among our most frequently used collections, and we're grateful to the many Latino families that have generously donated their documents and their stories to the IWA. And I would just say that at the beginning of the project, it was mainly oral history interviews that were being donated, and there was this push to gather those stories in between 2005 and 2007, as I said. And then gradually over time, written documents and collections were donated to the Iowa Women's Archives. The IWA has a history of gathering papers of those who are underrepresented in archives. In the early 90s, there was a project to preserve the history of African American women in Iowa. And then in the 2005, the Mujeres Latinas Project. And whatever the project is, there's a push at the beginning, but we never stopped the project. It's not in a very active phase, but we're continuing always to work with the donors and the families who have entrusted their papers to us. And we're constantly gathering new materials and accepting new collections. In this photograph, you see Laura Nelson, who's from the Quad Cities. She's interviewing Otilia Zavala, and in the photograph on the left, you see Otilia Zavala as a young girl, Tilly Gomez, standing in the Cooks Point barrio on the banks of the Mississippi River, which is where she grew up. To her right, you see the buckets used to carry water. And now I'll just show you a map of where that barrio was located, because these are the sorts of materials that come in, newspaper articles, as well as hand-drawn maps and recollections of life as it was in these barrio communities. And they tell of journeys to the Midwest from Mexico and how families settled. This map shows the barrio right on the Mississippi River. It occupied about 4 acres of land, and about 250 residents lived there during the period that it existed, which was between roughly 1900 and 1952, when the city evicted the residents and destroyed the houses there to make way for industrial development. In her interview, Otilia Zavala speaks of childhood chores, music, and religious and cultural traditions carried forward by Mexican women who managed households, raised children, and worked in factories and fields under often very arduous circumstances. The papers of Florence Taranis, as the family pronounces their name today, provide an example of the richness of the history preserved in these collections. Florence Taranis was born in Horton, Kansas, to Mexican immigrant parents. And this, if you recall the very first photograph on the slide, now we're going to identify. This is the Vallejo, as the family pronounces their name, sisters out in the backyard of their Des Moines home in 1945. Florence Taranis is the third from the left. She's the woman who donated the papers. And the papers include photographs, newspaper clippings, as well as her mother's memoir that was originally written in Spanish and then later, much later, translated into English by Florence for the benefit of her younger siblings who did not speak Spanish. So this is what that memoir looks like. It was hand printed in the 1950s by the family. and it was written in Spanish by Morado Vallejo. We know about Martina Morado because of her daughter's oral history, but also because she wrote her story, and her daughter, Florence Tiranis, generously donated her papers to the archives. In the photograph on the right, taken in 2012, 3 generations of the Morado's family descendants stand beneath a 5-foot banner of Martina Morado at the opening of an exhibit that was in the main UI library called Pathways to Iowa, Migration Stories from the Iowa Women's Archives. And this in many ways was the very beginning of the ideas and inspiration for the Migration is Beautiful website. Florence Tiranis, the donor of the papers there, stands under the banner of Martina Morado, between her daughter, Patty Franken, and granddaughter, Nicole Franken, who actually that year in 2012 was in her first year at the University of Iowa. But of course, Martina Morado's life story is more than just her personal narrative, because it is representative of the thousands of Mexican women who came north from Mexico in the 1910s and made the Midwest their permanent home, about whom we know far too little because they are underrepresented in archival repositories. And here is just a piece of the story that Martina Morado committed to posterity when she consciously wrote her story down for the benefit of future generations. And this is what she said. It was 1910. She was 13 years old. Soon after we left Mexico, the War of 1911 started. We arrived in the United States, April the 11th, 1910. I was 13. We settled in Kansas, a place Mother didn't like much. We lived with Mother's relatives, and she worked to support me and my brother. We ran a rooming house and did laundry for people. As time passed, we got used to living in this place that we found so cold. The central photograph was actually taken shortly after their arrival in Horton. You see Martina on the right standing next to her mother. Her mother was clearly a skilled seamstress, as you can tell by the clothes that they are wearing. In Horton, her mother took in laundry and cooked meals for railroad section hands. And it was in Horton that she met Julio Vallejo, who became her husband. In her memoir also, she tells of her meeting Julio and the 11 children that they had while living in Horton. And she recalled what happened. Her husband worked on the railroad, and during the Depression, he lost his job. She recalled that family had to go north to work in the sugar beet fields of northern Iowa and southern Minnesota. She described a terrible journey north by trucks, soaked by rain under a leaky tarp, and I believe she was pregnant at that time as well. But in the 40s, her husband once again found steady employment and with a job on the railroad, and that's when the family moved to Iowa. So this was just a panel from a piece for an exhibit case, I suppose, from the 2012 migration Pathways to Iowa exhibition. And so between 2014, so you can see where they begin their journey from Guanajuato, Mexico, and they travel up to Kansas. And that's a photograph of her with her children. And then finally, this last picture of the 7 sisters outside their Des Moines home. So now, as I mentioned before, this was the beginning of thinking about the Migration is Beautiful website and how that might come about. And so in between 2014 and 2012, we did work to expand the scope of this project and create, through the creation of a digital humanities project. So it took at least 2 years, and a lot of people helped in developing out the website. There were many students who worked on it and community partners. The League of United Latin American Citizens was our community partner, LULAC in Iowa. And of course, it took the technology wizards in the digital studio for the public humanities who helped build it out. We even had money to hire a professional to develop the wireframe for the website, the beautiful banner. And then finally, we were so fortunate that this incredible artist, the renowned artist, Fabiana Rodriguez, agreed to give us permission to use her work, which is the monarch butterfly with the mestizo faces and the wings, and the title Migration is Beautiful for the website. So that is how the website came to be so beautiful, with all these people's work and the generous agreement from Fabiana Rodriguez to use this incredible image. And throughout the development of the website, we worked with our community partners, LULAC, and tried to make the website meet the needs of the people who had donated their papers to us, so that it would be something that would resonate with them as a place they could go to read stories of their families and look, and everybody could look at the documents there. So there are three main components to the website. The first one is people, where you tell the story of individuals whose papers or oral history are preserved in the archives, and it includes oral history clips from the interviews as well as digitized documents from the collections. The second feature of the website is a section called Topics, and this is where there are four main topics that bring to put these documents into historical context. So it's roughly a chronological walk through the 20th century, beginning with early migration and then barrios and neighborhoods. So for example, you could go to barrios and neighborhoods and you would be able to click on Cook's Point and read more about that barrio or look at different barrios. And then there was impact of World War II. And then the last topic, there are just four, is LULAC in Iowa, and this really is a civil rights history of Iowa that includes migrant worker, farm worker activism and support for the California boycott of California table grapes and Cesar Chavez, and a lot of Chicano activism that went on in the 1960s and 70s. So I just will give you, and the last section, I should not leave this out. There is an interactive map. So this map, and I can't click on this because this is just a slide, but maybe in the Q&A we can go into this and take a look at the website in a little more detail. But the map draws on census data from the US Census of Population, the criteria being any individual born in any Latin American country between 1850 and 1940 who came to Iowa. And so there's a time slider, and you can see change over time as the pink dots on the map of Iowa get larger and smaller. And you can click on a dot, which is essentially a location, and it'll open up a little piece of the census, and you can see the name, the country of origin, the year the census was taken, the year the person was born, and it'll be one of 10, or maybe in 1880 it'll be one of 1, and by 1930 it's one of 650. So there are lots of ways that the website is challenging us to think, ask new research questions, and consider the investigation of Iowa's rich Latinx history. So I'm just going to grab a few things from the website or from the original documents in the archives. And so you might recognize in the center there the photograph of Esperanza Martinez, that I think it's Samantha who designed the poster for this event. And she made a beautiful poster using this photograph. It's incredibly small, but if you go onto the website and you go under people, you could read about Esperanza Martinez and her husband Cruz. And in this photograph, you see on the right, that is actually their wedding photograph. They met in Horton. They were Mexican. They came there from Mexico in the about 1920 or a little bit earlier, and they met there and got married and became migrant farm workers. And that's what brought them into Iowa from Kansas. They left and started traveling, and they lived in the Mason City area during the winter and followed the migrant stream during the growing season, with the entire family working in the fields. And they cultivated crops like sugar beets. In the lower left, you see a sugar beet field. This is actually from the Library of Congress. So we don't actually have any photographs of individuals working in the field in the archives, not surprisingly. But it took the entire family to work in the fields in order to eke out a living in the 1920s and 30s. And in the 30s, in the midst of the Great Depression, Esperanza Martinez's husband and her 16-year-old daughter, and that would be this little girl, was 16 years old. They both died in the 1930s, 1 year after each other, of tuberculosis, a disease that was prevalent among farm workers. As head of her household now, Esperanza Martinez had several other children to support. She made the decision to move to Cooks Point in Davenport, where she had a network of extended family that could support her. Esperanza Martinez is also, I don't think, maybe you can see the picture in the background here, but she's become the face of Mexican Iowa, because this photograph here has been used to create a poster that says migration is beautiful. And we take it, or at least we used to take it to public events when we did in-person events, and hand out these posters to students and members of the public. In fact, the family of Esperanza Martinez, of course, they loved that poster, and they would often come to the archives to visit their papers in the archives. And Esperanza, of course, died long before the papers came to the archives, but her children would come visit the archives. And Ray Martinez came to the archives a couple of years ago to celebrate his 90th birthday by looking at the family papers that are preserved there. So I do want to mention one of the topics is World War II. And so I want to talk a little about, there's a whole section called Impact of World War II, because the generation of US citizens born to Mexican immigrants came of age during World War II. And they served and died disproportionately during the war. Mary Vasquez, who also lived in Cooks Point in Davenport, she was the daughter of Mexican immigrants who came to Iowa in the 1920s, and her father had worked on the railroad. And she lost her two brothers within 3 months of each other during the war. As a result, she dropped out of school and went to work in a factory that manufactured covers for air rifles. In her interview, she vividly recalled the death of each of her brothers. She said, "We were living in Cooks Point when my two older brothers, Albert and Ralph, died. A policeman came to the door and asked if this was the Vasquez house, and then gave us the telegram. My mother was struck. It was awful for her. Troops returning from the war found that despite their sacrifices, little had changed. Discrimination in housing and employment persisted, and they were even denied access to VFW organizations and ended up forming their own chapter of the VFW in the Quad Cities. As the children of the first generation of Mexican immigrants came of age, they did demand more, and on returning after the war, one veteran explained, "We fought for the American ideals that our parents had taught us as children and believed our misfortune was merely a way of life. After the war, we clearly realized the deplorable conditions only existed because of racial discrimination. We were no longer afraid, like our parents, to confront the local officials regarding these terrible problems. Our battle for eliminating social discrimination was less frightening when compared to the horrors of the war we had recently experienced. After the war and the death of her brothers, Mary's mother bought a house in a white neighborhood in Davenport, and she moved in despite the petition that the neighbors circulated to keep them out. And this story of petitioning, sending petitions around neighborhoods to keep non-white residents, potential non-white residents out, is told frequently in these interviews. Mary became an activist. She co-founded a Davenport chapter of the American GI Forum. This was an organization that was originally formed in Texas, and it advocated for the civil rights of Mexican American veterans and promoted educational opportunities for Latino students by raising money for scholarship programs. Mary Olvera was, in this photograph, you see Mary Olvera standing to the right of Attorney General Robert Kennedy, and their husband is standing to her right. This is an annual convention of the National American GI Forum in Chicago in 1963. And but she had been active in the Viva Kennedy campaign in 1960. She had organized a tea for Rose Kennedy when she was touring during President John F. Kennedy's presidential campaign. She came to Davenport, and Mary Vasquez Olvera organized a tea for her. And this really was because the Latino organizations and the organizations of white Iowans, they were separate. And the white chapter of the League of Women Voters in the Quad Cities did not welcome Latinas, and they found their own ways of organizing their own organizations and pushing forward to advance the rights of Mexican Americans and Latinos and their children in Iowa. Another organization that was formed in Iowa is the League of United Latin American Citizens. The national organization was again formed in Texas in 1929, and in 1959 a council was organized in Davenport. Like the GI Forum, its members promoted scholarship programs, and they were staunch advocates of human rights and civil rights through political activism. In 1963, stay-at-home mom Lucy Vargas and her husband, who was the president of Council 10, and he also served on the Davenport Human Relations Commission, they bought a home in a white neighborhood, and her children integrated the white school. But the US-born bilingual Lucy Vargas did not feel welcome at the PTA meetings. So rather than work through those unresponsive PTAs at white schools, Vargas and other Mexican American women, they used the networks and resources of LULAC to plan for the educational future of their children. Each year they coordinated chili suppers and raffle ticket sales to raise money for educational scholarships for Mexican American students. And while the council's predominantly male leadership served on human relations commissions and local civil rights organizations, its women's proved indispensable to the day-to-day running of the council. Operating under the radar, these Midwestern Latino women maneuvered skillfully between family and community to uphold their rights in a largely patriarchal world. So we're into the 1960s, and I just want to mention briefly, under topics we are now squarely into LULAC in Iowa and this civil rights in Iowa. So I want to mention some of the advocacy work for agricultural laborers employed in Iowa, and how this generation of Mexican Americans that came of age during the war, that had experienced a lot of discrimination, became advocates not only for the very famous boycott of California table grapes that was sweeping the nation in the late 1960s, but they also were staunch advocates for the rights of migrant workers in Iowa, because many of them, you know, they had worked as migrant workers alongside their parents in the fields, and they understood this, and they wanted to improve those conditions. Now, inside this sign, Muscatine Migrant Committee, the original sign hangs inside of the door of the Iowa Women's Archives. It's very large. The Muscatine Migrant Committee was an agency that advocated for the rights of migrant workers who came through Iowa every year to harvest and cultivate tomatoes, because H.J. Heinz Corporation had a large canning facility. In fact, it was the second largest factory that it had in the company. It was located in Muscatine. And over 1,000 Mexican Americans would typically come from Texas and follow the migrant stream and come through Muscatine in the 1950s and 60s. So in 1967, Sister Irene Munoz, who you see up in the corner there, she arrived in Muscatine. She was a registered nurse, and she would spend the next 15 years ministering for providing health services to migrant workers. She was born to Mexican immigrants and raised in a working class neighborhood in West Des Moines. And she followed in the footsteps of her older sister when she became a nun. Actually, there were two older sisters, and there were three nuns in the family. And by the late 60s, the three nuns were all working in the Muscatine area and living there. This was Vatican II, and they wanted to go into the community and work for change. And so they were in Muscatine working on behalf of migrant workers. And by the late 60s, they had definitely developed a reputation as, and I'm quoting from her interview, troubleshooters on the front lines in the farming areas around Muscatine. Conditions in many Iowa migrant camps were poor. They lacked safe drinking water. They lacked screens on windows or sanitary facilities. And the nuns were regular visitors to the camps, whose owners became increasingly hostile to their presence. And this is what she said in her interview. Rabble rousers, they called us, Sister Irene remembered. I think about when we first arrived, my sister and I. They called us the good nuns. And then when we left, they called us the damn nuns. The racist exclusions enacted by the New Deal Congress in the 1930s had, in many ways, predetermined the ongoing poverty of farm workers in the country, and they foreshadowed the movement for justice that would follow. This meant that, as in other parts of the country, they weren't covered by the collective bargaining provisions of the National Labor Relations Act or by the minimum wage, overtime, and child labor provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act. Irene Guzman was born in Oklahoma in 1943. Her husband was the son of migrant workers, and his family traveled to Hampton, Iowa from Texas every year to work in a nursery planting evergreen trees and onions. Irene Guzman became active in an organization called the Migrant Action Program in the Mason City area. And women like Irene Guzman and Sister Irene Munoz worked to secure passage of a migrant child labor bill that would establish a minimum age for the employment of migrant children on Iowa farms. Irene Guzman testified before the House Committee, and the bill faced so much opposition from Heinz Corporation and tomato growers around Muscatine. They were deeply afraid that it would put them at a disadvantage with neighboring Illinois. As I mentioned before, there was no federal legislation that was enforceable at this time, so it had to go through the state legislature. And the bill did pass, but it was very weak. It passed the Iowa legislature in 1967, and what it did was it prohibited farmers from knowingly employing migrant children under 10 at any time, and migrant children under 14 during school hours. And the use of the word knowingly made the law virtually unenforceable, as farmers could always plead ignorance of the age of children working on their farms. So here is a photograph of the passage of that migrant child labor law. Iowa Governor Harold Hughes is standing in the middle, and Irene Guzman is standing on the right. And of course, the issue of farm labor was a big issue in the 1960s, and there was a strong connection between California and Iowa, because in Iowa, Mexican Americans strongly supported the national boycott of California table grapes that was led by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. In 1969, Cesar Chavez came to Davenport for a boycott rally in the Quad Cities. And the photograph, the newspaper clipping you see here, was taken on International Grape Boycott Day in 1969, and it shows, you know, Iowa LULAC and their allies, other organizations, civil rights organizations like the NAACP and CORE, stepping up to boycott local supermarkets in order to prevent them from buying California table grapes. So the president of the Huelga Committee was Henry Vargas, and he's standing in this newspaper clipping carrying the sign "Justice and Dignity for the Farm Worker." And again, if I could take you back, that's Lucy Vargas's husband, who I mentioned earlier, who was very involved in LULAC. And so I want to take it back just a minute to talk a little about how the documents come in, because they do come in sporadically. And when I interviewed Salvador Lopez for this project, he told me that there were some documents that we were talking about this period in LULAC's history and how the council supported the boycott campaign. And he said there were some documents up in the attic of that LULAC center. And so he got some of the younger membership to go in and get up in the attic and bring them down. And it just gave me chills when they brought the materials out of the attic, because there were flyers and there was a spiral bound notebook, things that really documented in some detail the ways in which the LULAC Council in Iowa had supported the boycott. I mean, they had minutes of their meetings saying who was coming, who belonged to the committee. There were many women actively involved in this, and who was coming and what other organizations were supporting them in this battle. And so they, you know, they'd have little notations. Oh, Alicio Medina, who was the the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee director for the Midwest. He came, and so did the national secretary come from California, Antonio Orendine, and then Cesar Chavez came. And even Dolores Huerta remembers that Iowa LULAC was very strong in its support of the Great Boycott campaign. And in fact, we have to remember that it was Dolores Huerta, who's the co-founder of the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee with Cesar Chavez, who actually had the idea to have this boycott of California table grapes. So let's just see how this plays out and comes back to Iowa. The year is 1969, and Iowa activists, you see them, Viva la Causa, the League of United Latin American Citizens. They are marching into Des Moines in support of 2 migrant worker bills pending in the state legislature. One to improve standards of living on migrant camps in Iowa, and another to strengthen that migrant child labor bill from what had passed 2 years earlier. So I'm sure I've given you too much of a history there, and let's take it back to the Migration is Beautiful website. And I think I'll stop sharing so that I can see you and answer your questions. Does that sound like a good idea?
Sounds good.
Okay, let's see. Now I can see everybody's names, and so, you know, I know I talked a lot about history, but I think that's the power of archives, is it not? That we have the capacity to bring in the documents, and when we build an inclusive archival repository, we can make the understanding and interpretation of history more inclusive, and make sure that everybody, like Michaela Terrones, can find themselves in the archives.
Well, thank you so much, Janet. It has been a pleasure talking to you and learning about the Mujeres Latinas Project and the Migration is Beautiful one at the University of Iowa Libraries. For more information, we are going to include the links on the chat. And this program was brought to you by the Society of American Archivists Student Chapter and the Reforma SJSU High School Student and Alumni Group. A recording of this presentation without the Q&A of this event will be posted on both of our YouTube channels, probably within a week. Thank you all for joining us today. For more information about the Society of American Student and Chapter and the Reforma SJSU High School Student Group, we will have information in the chat as well. Thank you, Janet, again.
Thank you all very much for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Janet.